Assalamu alaikum. I love talking about some of the stories that, starting these things, to give people an idea about the human side of being Muslim. Because I'm always shocked to find out that there are so many people really who have never met Muslims. And I think that, it's very easy to have a conception of a scary persona, something that, you just don't really know what to think if you've never met a Muslim. And I think that it's really incumbent on everyone in every situation that you can, or every opportunity that you might have, to share your personal story and humanize what it means to be Muslim. Hopefully people will see that it's just a very, human experience. But we have to break that barrier, and we have to start telling our stories. And so I like taking this opportunity to talk about my story. For me, my passion is always about converts and conversion, but also about sort of the transformation in kind of choosing this journey to become Muslim. And hopefully that, can help people, understand what it means to be Muslim. So, I always say that what is the point of being, part of any faith or any religion, and definitely what is the point of being Muslim if it doesn't have a transformative effect in your life and make you a better human being. And so one of the most difficult transformations that I had to make after I became a Muslim was realizing that I was a racist and that I was raised as a racist. And this is a really difficult thing to admit to yourself. No one wants to say that they are a racist. No one wants to admit it, because it's like saying I'm a very ugly person inside. And I think it's really hard to do that. But especially here in America, and especially in California. But I think that, but I was raised a racist, and it comes from the messages that you get from your upbringing. So I don't know how, but somehow, my family is Taiwanese. They were immigrants, as I mentioned before, and I think by the time that I was aware that I was even Chinese, somehow, maybe through my mother's breast milk, I also became aware of what the Asian hierarchy of racism is. And I didn't know any people from any of these other Asian cultures, but through whatever I experienced, I understood that Taiwanese were at the top of that hierarchy, and then below that were probably mainland Chinese and Japanese. And then somewhere below that would come maybe people from Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, and at the very bottom of that hierarchy were people from, let's say, Vietnam and the Philippines, and Cantonese people. So I could definitely recite that without any evidence. And then if you look at sort of what your parental expectations are for who you marry, I think that is also very revealing. So by the same token, I told you before, I was raised to sort of look up to white culture, and so for me it was very clear from my, I needed, the best thing would be if I married a white person. And then if I can't marry a white person, then, I should marry maybe someone who's Chinese, and that down the road, after actually Chinese or Japanese, it kind of becomes a skin color. So it's like, you don't want to marry someone who's brown, and God forbid, someone who's black. And for me, of course, I'm an only child, so this was actually, also a very big influence for my psyche. And then if you layer on top of that skin color something like Muslim, oh my God, that's like the worst you could do. So thankfully, I made a very good choice in who I married. And, but of course, as you can imagine, that sent all kinds of shockwaves through my family, and it's part of my whole story of the struggle of conversion. But this is a, I don't say this actually to blame my parents, because, obviously, racism is something that we all know is brewing and explosive, and it's kind of the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about, but it's really, reaching seismic levels. And I think it's something that is really important that we have to understand. And, it has to start with sort of an understanding of who you are and being very honest about, what your views are and what you inherited from your upbringing. So, as Dr. Abdel talked about in actually the khutbah from last Friday, as well as some previous halaqas, racism was the reason why Shaitan was, thrown out by God. So it's really interesting because you think, this is sort of the Muslim original sin, if you think in terms of what was the original sin. And racism, obviously is with us as human beings from the very beginning. So, what did that look like for me? I mean, it was, I think, aside from the obvious, if you see someone who's African American, I think, people would say, okay, maybe you clutch your purse a little bit harder or you get a little bit fearful. But I think that the racism comes in the nuance. And part of understanding, how deeply you're affected is seeing, like, what are your reactions? So, it had gotten even to a point where it's like, okay, if I speak to someone who is African American or, Mexican or whatever, I would almost pat myself on the back and say, see, I'm not racist. I talk to people who are, not of the white race. But if you think about that, that's disgusting. If you start thinking about, okay, my patience level for interacting with white people is endless. I can be extremely patient and kind and whatever, but how is my patience level when I'm dealing with someone who's not white? And these are the sorts of things that, are really, really difficult to interrogate. But I bring this up because, if you are Muslim and you want to have any hope of ethical or spiritual uplift, you simply cannot be a racist. And you have to do the hard work of understanding, what your orientation is and deal with it. So, what did that mean as far as, attacking it? Like, how do you break this? And, simply, there's nothing really magical to it. It's actually really just first knowing who you are, knowing the truth of who you are, where you came from. All the little comments that you might hear from whoever. It's like, oh, those Jews, oh, those, those Mexicans, oh, those whatever. And, being sensitized to hearing those kinds of comments. And also putting yourself in that person's shoes. I mean, it's truly the golden rule. It's like, how do you want to be treated? That's how you should treat others. And it's sort of funny for a Chinese person to say, I'm a racist, because it's like, I have definitely been the recipient of racism. I mean, you know how it tastes, you know how it smells, you know when someone's treating you based on how you appear, not because of who you are. So I actually really have no excuse. Like, I would get into fights with my parents because they would be racist about Muslims or something, and I'd be like, how can you do that? You're Chinese, you know how it feels. How can you turn around and then be that way to someone else? But you can. It's very easy. It can, be very much part of what you slip into. So I was fortunate that, the racism that was directed at me was not, to the level of danger. So, for example, that, Muslims are getting exposed to today, or that African Americans deal with on a daily basis. But, at the same time, it doesn't feel good. And there's a really interesting book out that just came out called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And it's really interesting because it's written about how white people cannot talk about racism. Like, they become very fragile because they don't like to see themselves as, well, obviously as being racist, and there are certain reasons why that is, and it's a book about how do you talk to white people about racism without making them sort of cringe and, and deny everything that you're saying, and how do you get them to see that, racism is something that's real, and that they're not just objective and individual, and that they're not, they're immune from it. And that's a really interesting, book to look into. I was actually looking at it online. It was fascinating. But those are for people who actually, I think, have not really had the experience of being discriminated against. And, for all of us, I think, as Muslim, we have had that experience. And, we know what it likes and know what it feels like to be considered something other than what we are. And I think that if we want to play, let's say, a leading role in making change in our world, knowing that, the notion of racism as our original sin is something that is, part of our tradition that we need to fight, then we need to start by cleaning our own house. And I know that when I see, cultural centers or mosques that are Pakistani and Arab and, whatever organized by ethnicity or by race, that tells me that we are not in a place where we can, be on the leading front of racism. And I think that, if we can start by interrogating ourselves as individuals and interrogating our communities, then we can start to really make a change and offer something to humanity, because we know that racism is going to be a serious problem in the coming days, and it already is. And the thing that's really beautiful, I mean, I sort of think to myself that I'm a recovering racist, because it's hard. It's like racism was one of those things that it's as familiar to you as your parents. I mean, it's been as long, it's been with you as long as you've been alive. So it is really difficult to, work hard and see it in yourself and try to change it. But the thing is, when you actually start to do that, you start to walk in people's shoes, you start to talk to people, you recognize that they're having a very human experience like you start being able to look beyond a person's skin color, their appearance, and I noticed that you start to see people through their eyes. You hear this expression that your eyes are the window to your soul. And I think one of the most beautiful things that, and I pray all the time that, Allah helps me overcome all of these weaknesses, and I say this, it's obviously not very comfortable to say, hey, I'm a racist, or I was a racist, but I do it because I think it's so important that we all approach our lives with that kind of honesty. And when you can start to see people from the light of their soul, through their eyes, through their behavior, through how they treat other people, it changes your life, and it makes your life richer and more beautiful. And so I think that it's exciting, and I just want to tell people you can overcome racism, but it takes a lot of hard work. And anyway, so that's my story for today.
Thank you.